This lesson is a continuation of our lesson on Jesus at the synagogue in Nazareth and what is happening with that interaction. So if you haven't seen the lesson breaking down the text of Jesus at the synagogue in Nazareth, make sure you go back and view that one, because this one won't make sense. So see that one first. That's it's week 19 or part 19A, and this is going to be part 19B. And what we're going to do today is at the very end of that synagogue service with Jesus, the crowd gets furious. That's what the text says, or they're very angry. They take Jesus out to a cliff and they're going to push him off. And what we don't understand is that is a Jewish stoning. So this is what we're going to talk about in this lesson. We're going to talk about the ideas behind the death penalty, the principles behind a death penalty and a stoning. And this is what the rabbis had come up with, because if God says do a stoning, you have to ask, well, then how are we going to agree to do that as a community? And it's the same thing that we would have today. If we have a death penalty, then we have to come up with how are we going to conduct that death penalty. And the rabbis did the same thing. So this is what we're going to look at in this lesson. And then we're going to talk about group dynamics. And wherever you find people in a group, you're going to find dynamics that can get out of control. Because why did those people at Nazareth get so upset? Why did they turn on Jesus so quickly? And why were they trying to just get rid of him? Couldn't they accept his evaluation of their faith? So that's what we'll be doing today. Enjoy the lesson. Now, what are they about to do? Well, it says they took Jesus out of town. They took him to the edge of a hill in order to push him off. They're going to kill him. But you're not allowed just to take anybody and throw him off the side of a hill. That's mob mentality. God doesn't like mob mentality. He wants the individual to remain strong as an individual. Collectively, when we get into groups, you can lose your individuality. So I just want to very briefly go over some rules governing the death penalty, and in particular stoning, because that's what it is. So I'm going to do this fairly quickly, but this is what's happening. I'll show you. I'll give you a little example of a stoning in a minute. So first of all, everything about a death penalty and justice is supposed to be carried out by the community. Now, that's no different. Today, it's our communities in the form of their departments of justice that are going to carry out, administer justice. But ultimately, it's the people who need to understand the principles of justice and make sure the groups that are doing it for us are doing it properly. So one thing, as with any death penalty, right? So we might hear here in the United States, there's two arguments at least. I'm sure there's more. You might have an argument of whether you should have a death penalty or not. That's the first argument. And in this case, God says there will be a death penalty for certain things, and he has his reasons. And you would say, okay, but it's not just go mob kill them. There are other principles that God has laid out. Once you decide there is a death penalty, the second one is, how do you do it? How are you going to do it? What are the convictions going to be? What are the standards for convicting someone to a death penalty? And these are all within our legal system. And so we're so used to having them there, we don't really think about them. But the first thing would be that they have to be properly judged. This has to be adjudicated. And in that ancient world, in Israel, the place for judging was the city gate. So you take someone to the city gate, and that's where they're going to hold court. So there has to be a proper adjudication. There has to be at least 2 to 3 witnesses. I'll show you in a minute. The scripture says you can't have the witness of one person, right? Because one person could take revenge against their enemy and falsely accuse them of a crime. But it's tougher when you've got 2 to 3 people that are all going along with that. So, but 2 to 3 witnesses. God doesn't want any mob justice, right? So he's going to start to slow down the process and put in all these barriers to the mob getting out of hand. In fact, one of them we'll see here in the text is that the 2 to 3 witnesses that come forth, at least 2 to 3, they have to be the ones that are actually going to administer the death penalty at first. So it would be like today, if someone said, I saw that guy murder this person, then they're the one that pulls the switch on the electric chair. Now, what if they lied? What if they were lying? Well, if you lie and he's actually an innocent person and you pull the switch on the electric chair, you just became a murderer. You murdered an innocent person. And so it would be a barrier to somebody making a false accusation. And then all of these principles are going to be read through one of the, as Jesus says, it's the second greatest commandment besides love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how would you, if you had to be put to death, what would you like to have happen to you? Would you like it to be slow and torturous or fast and as painless as possible? How would you like to be adjudicated? Would you like a judge that takes bribes, or would you like to know that your judge doesn't take bribes? So every principle of justice or the rules that are put in place have to be read through the lens of love your neighbor as yourself. What would you like have happen to you? So if we look at like Deuteronomy 17, you can check this out on your own. I'd read about judges, read about these laws. So it says in verse 5, take the man or woman who has done this evil, take him to the city gate. Now, you have to put a little pause there, because what's done at the city gate, well, that's the place of judging. So it has to be adjudicated properly. It's not just saying, take them to the city gate and throw stones at them. It's take them to the city gate, pause, because in other areas of the text, you're going to judge properly. And if they've been convicted, then you're going to stone that person to death. Now, if God says stone them to death, well, what does that mean? How do we actually conduct a stoning? Okay. Verse 6, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. The person is to be put to death on the testimony of 2 to 3 witnesses, but no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. Again, it would be too easy if we had somebody as our enemy that we could lie about and think we could get away with it. But it's tougher to bring somebody else in and to be part of your lie. And then it says this, verse 7, the hands of the witnesses, meaning they're going to be the ones who pull the switch, metaphorically speaking. They're going to push you off the cliff first. Because if you're guilty of your crime, then God's okay with it. You just administered justice. But if they were innocent and you knew it, now you're a murderer, and God's going to judge you as the murderer. So the hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting that person to death. And then comes the rest of the community. If you think they're guilty, you're going to participate in the justice. Now, if you don't think they're guilty, don't throw a stone, because that way you won't be judged by God if you got it wrong. Okay, now let me just show you one thing. I'm going to use this photo, change photos on you. This is a photo of the city Lystra that is in Turkey today, but it's in the book of Acts. And this is a place where Paul gets stoned. They take him out of town and they stone him. Now, oddly enough, he lives, so that's remarkable. So in doing that, we're going to talk through what are the principles that the rabbis put together based on their full reading and their understanding of the Bible that have to do with these principles of stoning. Well, I've covered a lot of these. So you want to do something that's quick, or even to minimize the pain. You're not torturing the person. That's not God's justice. He's not a torturer. So it's quick. You minimize the pain. You don't disfigure the body, because whose image is the body made in? God's. So don't disfigure the body. You preserve as much dignity as possible. And then, like I said, you're going to read through the lens of love your neighbor as yourself. That's part of that biblical framework. What would I want done to me if I must be put to death by the community? Okay? Now, there's also a whole bunch of principles of justice that are going to come into this. You want to slow the mob down. If their passions get out of hand, the mob can do terrible things that people wouldn't do if they were just acting individually. You do not want people acting out of anger. So you want to get it as dispassionate as possible. Okay, so I mentioned the two witnesses. The two witnesses are the ones that administer the penalty. And then this one is where we get really confused when we read that word stoning. We picture the Hollywood type stoning. And the Hollywood type stoning is a whole bunch of people are all angry. It's mob justice. They tie the person up or they bury them, up to their hips in the ground, whatever it is. And they throw little teeny stones at them. So you're taking out your anger on this person. You're torturing them because you're hitting them with little stones. That's not a biblical stoning, or at least it's not in the Jewish writings how you do a stoning. You want to avoid all of that. And what you do is everybody gets one stone. So you can carry as big a stone as you want, but you only get one. And if you miss, that's it. You're done. Because you're not allowed to take out your frustrations on somebody. They're not your scapegoat. God doesn't want you to do that. So it would look something like this, and this is written in the Talmud, the rabbinic writings. What you want to find is something that's at least 12 to 18 feet high. So what does it say in Luke? They took him to the brow of a hill or a cliff, on the hill which the city was built, in order to throw him off. Because they need something where you can push the person. And hopefully, ideally, there's stone at the bottom, so that when they hit, they've hit stone. And now if they die right away, the stoning's over. You don't desecrate the body. So 12 to 18 feet high. Stone at the bottom if possible, or you don't choose that spot. You lead the person who's been convicted. You have at least 2 to 3 witnesses. Can't do one. And those 2 to 3 witnesses are going to push the person off. And so they end up down on the stone, and God willing, that completes it. If they die, nobody throws a stone. If they don't die, now each person gets one stone, and you drop it. If you miss, you're done. If the person doesn't die, like in Paul's case, like everybody threw a stone who thought he was guilty, Paul gets back up and goes on. So there's a lot more rules, just like today, where we have all kinds of rules when it comes to a death penalty. If we have to do one, should we have a death penalty rule? And if we do, then how are we going to do it? And how do we keep the mob from going nuts? Because when there's an injustice in the community, you do not want the vengeance of other people coming out and trying to right the wrongs. God does not want that, categorically. He wants administered justice. Okay? So, if we go back to Luke 4, verse 30, it gets to the end of this. They take him out to the edge of the cliff, the hill which the city was built on, and it says, verse 30, he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Who's actually going to be the person to push him off the cliff? You could see what happened here. As mad as they were, they didn't commit the act. Because they know if I push him off the cliff, God's going to judge me for murder. So I have to control my passions that get out of control. This is also, you have to take that commandment that says, if you have a disobedient child, stone them to death. And we read that and think, that's horrific. Why would you do that to your child? Well, okay, now add in everything I just said about a stoning and all the principles of justice. And what you realize is that commandment, even though it's written in brevity, and unfortunately we don't read it with all of the added information, a commandment that says, if you have a disobedient child, stone them to death, means that the fate of your child is taken out of your hand. Because how many parents, fed up with their child, would take out vengeance themselves and think they can get away with it? God doesn't want that to happen. So God says, do a stoning. Oh, well, if you do a stoning, that means you have to take them to the city gates. And when you get to the city gates, the judges take over and it's not your case. And there has to be multiple witnesses. And oh, by the way, if he was really that disobedient, those witnesses are going to be the ones. You can see what's happening. God's slowing down the passions of people that are going to do things that they'll ultimately regret and are disruptive to society. So he wants to slow that down. In this case, the slowing down, actually, the rules worked. Now, none of that is written in our New Testament because it doesn't have to be. That New Testament audience had the Old Testament. They had it memorized. We don't need to reiterate everything that's in the Old Testament for them to understand all of the things that are being read into this. Okay. The second part, or the last thing that I'll leave you with, it has to do with group dynamics. Because what we see here at the Nazareth event is the takeover of the collective. The group dynamics, that when Jesus walks in and points something out to the group, there's a shift in the entire collective nature of the group. And you will find this in every group, everywhere, from college campuses to high schools, to families, to work environments, to politics, and definitely in religious settings. And so I ended up going to a seminary that had, as part of the seminary, or part of the school, they had a marriage and family therapy section, or psychology. And they trained Christian counselors, addiction counselors, marriage and family therapists. So on the staff, you have psychology professors. And this was so wonderful, because if you're training someone to go out and lead a church, what are you training them to do? Well, right here, you have to lead group dynamics. Now, if you've only been taught theology, here's the creed, everybody's happy once you agree to that creed. It's like, no, none of it's happy, because all of us show up to that group with baggage, family baggage, life baggage, and then you show up to the group, and now you create your own baggage, and as that group evolves over periods of time, it'll create its own issues, because that's what every group does. So you have to know about group dynamics. You have to know hurt people go to church, and hurt people hurt people. And you get crazy people with personality disorders that show up to churches. So you can have narcissists take over, and you can have sociopaths, and you can have, this is a real problem in churches. If you have a male pastor and a female who, because he's in a position of authority, thinks they're going to get married, or they're going to have, intimate relations. And pastors need to be aware that that projection is happening, and they need to be aware, and their staff needs to be aware, that those people will be showing up to church. And of course, funny pastor I had in San Diego, he says, I got a message that the woman says that God led her to this church, and when she saw me, she said, we're supposed to get married. And then he's like, well, God didn't give me that same message. So until he does, that's what happens. You have to understand psychology, group dynamics, because if you're going about life and you're completely unaware of it, it can take over your group. So, for instance, and I think this is what the example that this is giving us of what's happening at Nazareth is, the group has grown and morphed into something that the early founders of that group wouldn't even recognize. And that when Jesus points it out, they don't say, oh, geez, thank you for pointing out the unconscious assumptions that we have going on that we're not aware of. They're like, no, we're just going to kill you, because getting rid of you is easier than facing our own flaws. Okay. Now, what I have on the handout, and I will share with you in a minute, comes from this book right here, Becoming Whole and Holy. And it's about the process of spiritual maturity, what we call Christian formation, that all of us are supposed to mature and grow as Christians. And when you mature and grow, you reduce the anxiety of, say, the unknown, or if there's a tense situation, Part of acting properly through tense or difficult situations is being mature. And so these three professors, they were all at Bethel. Janine Brown, she's a New Testament professor. Carla Dahl and Wendy Corbin Rushling. And it's a great book about spiritual formation and integrating that with the Bible. But let me show you some that talk about group dynamics. And this is really key, that we can objectively look at our churches without allowing the passions, because if you don't know what's happening, or the more you know about, the more you're aware of how groups act, the less you'll participate in bad action. So what we see happening in Nazareth is they have something that this book calls a family story. It's not reality, but it's the story we all tell ourselves. And everybody agrees with it, and there's collective pressure to agree with it. So even if you're a little unsure, you're not going to say it. You're not going to question it. And their family story is something like, we're from the line of David, God's going to bless us, and we don't have to worry about anything else, right? No other action is required on our part. And again, I'll point you to, here are the verses, Matthew 3:9, Luke 3:8, John 8:39, where they're contending with the people who have this claim to God's favor, but they're not acting in the appropriate manner. That's part of what that verse means. So it requires a turning. That's repentance. I'm going down the wrong path. I need to turn and get back to the place that God really wanted me. And then what happens is, when you have especially a tight-knit group, a small group, a tight group like Nazareth, anxiety can run wild. And this will happen in families, in churches, again, political groups, student bodies at colleges or high schools. And they can be driven by anxiety without being aware that it's happening. So if anybody introduces a new experience or a new idea or a challenge for the group to think differently, suddenly everybody's anxiety goes up. And that anxiety within a group will feed off of each other. Okay? So here's a quote from the book. As the need to defend against anxiety increases, meaning something's been introduced to us that we don't like, then your need to defend against it goes way up. And your need to know, meaning curiosity, let me ask you more about that. Tell me more. Let me consider your point of view. Your need to know goes way down. Your mind becomes incrementally closed to different views. Now, does that describe churches in a nutshell? And all of this is, you're trying to more rigidly hold on to what you believe, and that will cause more security to come in, but it doesn't. It causes more anxiety. And so if you have these rigid groups, they can be very resistant to change, because our group story, you just questioned our whole group story. So what do we need to do? What is Jesus calling us to do? What is Paul calling us to do? What is Peter calling us to do? Is to mature. You have to grow spiritually. You have to mature and adapt. And when you grow spiritually, your tolerance to change increases exponentially. You can manage a stressful event and still remain in conversation with one another. So tolerating change and managing stressful events require strong character, courage, spiritual maturity. And so we look at those people in Nazareth, they're not responding maturely, they're acting like children. And so this is a case study, right? What we have in front of us. But we need to bring in people who are experts in group dynamics and collective thinking and what happens with people who are riddled with anxiety. And when they come together, what happens, right? Because what Jesus is doing, and this is really the study in exclusion, they want to get rid of him. He's a member of that community, but he moves away from the past, from that familiar story. And because he moved away from it, He's going to be threatened with exclusion, and whether that's emotionally and even physically, and that's what they want to do. They want to throw him off a cliff. Those who go against a distorted family story are often ostracized, scapegoated, or believed to be bad. I mean, there's the story of Jesus. He shows up not to create a new religion, but to reform Judaism, to get Judaism back on the path, to say, get back to your original mission of being a light to the world, so that all the other nations can look at us and say, oh, that is an amazing God that you have. I want to follow that God too. But that's not what happened. They became isolated and rigid and said, God only blesses us and has nothing to do with you. There you go. That's the story of Jesus. And he's ostracized, and he becomes the scapegoat. He is scapegoated. And they believe he's bad. They say, oh, he must have a demon, right? But it's not because they're Jewish. It's because they're human beings. And we have to guard against ourselves doing the same thing. So I put on here, because it's so much more difficult, rather than examining their underlying assumptions and facing that challenge of adjusting their thinking, what did they do? Let's get rid of Jesus. Throw him off a cliff. All of our problems will go away. Okay? Now again, this is found everywhere, folks. It's at work. It's in politics, especially in churches. Okay, so a couple things that we can take from this. First of all, they're not rejecting him because of his claim of being a Messiah. It's him criticizing their faith. He's questioning their group story. All of their anxiety went up. Their need for more information went way down. And judgment comes up. The passions take over, and they want to get rid of Jesus. And second, the story really gives us an example and a warning for our own churches, our own groups, at how quickly that group, when the collective thought turns, if you're not strong in your character and have the courage to stand as an individual, those collective forces will take over. And it's up to you, and I mean you. If I had a camera, if you could see my finger, I'd be pointing at you. You as the individual. You have to grow and mature as a Christian and be aware of what happens with groups. Because if you're not, if it stays in the unconscious, you will go along with it and you won't even know that it's happening. So these forces are alive. And churches often move away from the path that they were intended to be on, but collectively, they don't know. And you find that everywhere. So I hope this at least gives you an idea of what's happening with that city of Nazareth, the synagogue, because we often get that incorrect, and that all of us are called to grow in strength and character, to grow in maturity. And the only way to do that is to challenge everything inside of you. Start with the prayer, Psalm 139. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and see if there's anything inside of me that needs to be changed. And you know what God will do? He will show you. Then it takes strength of character, courage, to face the thing that God's going to show you and to do something about it, rather than try to ignore it because it's too uncomfortable. So this is a great lesson for all of us in our personal growth, and that we have to slow down, look at the things, the stories that we tell ourselves about the text that aren't really there. Slow down, have the courage to say, I don't think that's what that says. That's tough to do. It's real tough to do, and I know that. God willing, this will give you the encouragement to go out. The thing is God wants to give you the courage to be the individual that stands and says, that's not the right thing to do. And that person will ultimately be known for their courage. Just like throughout history, those who have stood up courageously, they're still talked about today. They're shining stars, examples. They give us a story to follow to build our own courage. That's in part, hear me say that, in part, that's the story of Jesus. That we're supposed to have him as a star to guide us in our life, to help us understand how we are to walk through life and be completely aware, our eyes opened to how we're behaving.